Traditional National Signing Day has become somewhat insignificant to many, but at LSU, they picked up a definite plus in a five-star defensive lineman. We've got Wilson Alexander on the line from The Advocate to break down some LSU football for us. Wilson, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mark. How are you doing today?
I am doing just fine. How are you?
Doing well.
Good. Brian Kelly, doing well, it appears. LSU recruits itself to a certain extent, and he certainly dug in when it comes to staying in state. And we know that when it comes to Louisiana, per capita in producing NFL players, no state's better. And when he's able to keep, I see 8 of 10 and 12 of 15 in terms of the top players in the state at home, that's a good thing.
It absolutely is. It's what they want to be able to do in their recruiting classes year after year is use Louisiana and its border states, especially Mississippi and East Texas, as kind of the foundation of the program. And you didn't really see that until this cycle. The first year a staff's coming in, trying to kind of get its legs underneath it. There's a scramble there. The first sort of full cycle, LSU kind of leaned on some of its national connections. But in this one, you really saw for the first time LSU kind of lock down the state of Louisiana and lean on those border states. And coming out of the early December, so the early signing period in December, LSU had 11 of the top 14 players in Louisiana signed at that point. But there was still one out there. And there would have been, even when talking about how well LSU had done within the state, there would have been an exception if they hadn't gotten this guy, and that's Dominic McKinley, the consensus five-star defensive tackle, the number one player in Louisiana, was committed to Texas A&M at the time. But because Texas A&M started going through a coaching change after firing Jimbo Fisher, that kind of opened the door for for LSU to get back in there with Dominic McKinley and his family. Even though LSU itself was going through some coaching changes on the defensive side of the ball and hadn't even made those changes yet at that point, Dominic McKinley ends up flipping on New Year's Eve and staying solid with that throughout the next month, signing with LSU on Wednesday without any drama attached to it whatsoever. And kind of finishing up this class for LSU now with, like you said, 12 of the top 15 players in the state are headed to LSU. And Dominic McKinley is the one five-star in the group. And LSU has him now too at a position of critical need for this program right now. They really need defensive tackles. And Dominic McKinley is the kind of prospect who you can start to build around there as a consensus five-star.
In addition to McKinley, Wilson, anybody that could possibly be even further down the list in regards to the star ratings, but that you particularly like and think could maybe even step up as a freshman or has long-term potential?
Well, the one that immediately comes to mind is Trey'Dez Green. He's kind of the number 2 highest rated player in LSU's class, and he's just almost kind of a unicorn type player. He's a 6'7" tight end with a basketball background who can really jump. He kind of played wide receiver his senior year of high school just because of the offense that he was in, and he's somebody who is a really intriguing pass catcher. Who maybe can get on the field in that capacity early in his career when LSU goes to some multiple tight end sets. We'll see how he continues to physically develop because he's going to have to get better as an inline blocker and those sorts of things, something he just didn't do a ton of as a senior in high school. But Trey'Dez Green would probably be a name to keep an eye on. They have 6 offensive linemen in this class. So any number of those could end up getting on the field, maybe not early, but just at some point in their career as they continue to build the offensive line. Someone else who could probably get on the field early would be 2 names that jump out. It would be Deshaun McBride, who's one of their safeties. He's kind of a top 100 player. And LSU, just because of kind of the way their roster is right now, safety is a position where a young player could probably get on the field a little bit early. The other one, Caden Durham, same sort of situation. We know running backs are usually able to get on the field a little bit earlier in their careers than most other positions. And LSU's only got 3 other scholarship running backs. So Caden Durham would be somebody who could also probably get on the field early in some capacity.
We've got Wilson Alexander on the line from The Advocate, breaking down some LSU football for us. And of course, as we look to the transfer portal, which has become, for a lot of people, in terms of fan base, the focus of recruiting. But I think that the traditional high school recruiting should still be the lifeblood of any program, and this should be more of a supplemental thing. 17 leave the program. The most notable and the most recent, I should say, would be Denver Harris, who was a top 25 recruit, who I believe chose Texas A&M in a battle with LSU. Then he comes back to LSU, and now he's moving on to Texas A&M or Texas San Antonio. And it's the type of journey that we're going to see on a regular basis out of these players very soon and already are. Just your thoughts about anyone with a particular impact in terms of the loss side of this transfer equation this offseason?
Really two who would be a loss. One is Logan Diggs, their starting running back last season. Had an injury of some kind. We never learned the nature and severity of it, but in LSU's bowl game. And the expectation was really more so that he wouldn't be on the roster next year, but probably because he had gone to the NFL. He ends up entering the transfer portal and going to Ole Miss, one of LSU's rivals. And so that was certainly a loss to see him stay within the SEC like that, somebody who's on LSU's schedule next year. And then also Zalance Hurd, who's a five-star offensive tackle who LSU signed last year, played in every game as a freshman, excuse me, even started once. But he decided to enter the transfer portal after the regular season and ends up going to Tennessee. And Zalance probably wouldn't have started next year, or at least it might have been difficult for him to start next year because of what LSU's bringing back on the offensive line. But when you lose a five-star like that, who comes from Louisiana, that was certainly a loss too. Denver wasn't even really much of a loss for this team because last year he never really consistently cracked the starting lineup. There was discipline issues that happened in the preseason, and then the second half of the year he wasn't playing. He wasn't around the team at all, and so he obviously had the name recognition, and maybe as a prospect he can maybe finally pan out at UTSA. But he's always just had some discipline baggage and had a hard time staying on the field both his freshman year at Texas A&M and then his sophomore year last year at LSU. And so, again, maybe he can pan out at UTSA and really tap into that potential that we saw as a recruit coming out of high school. But it seemed like it wasn't going to happen there at LSU. They tried to give him a second chance and give him an opportunity, and it just didn't really come together. And so him moving on was not a surprise for that team because that was kind of the expectation once he wasn't around the second half of the season.
Wilson, on the plus side, it's only a quantity of 6, but Xavier Thomas is one guy that stands out to me as a productive player in college. A.J. Swan's a quarterback who was a part-time starter at Vanderbilt. The other thing that comes to mind is you see most of these guys are coming from major programs. So the talent evaluation was there coming out of high school, and maybe just things didn't work out at their original school of choice.
Yeah, LSU was able to be much more selective in the transfer portal this year, targeted in its needs. LSU, the last 2 years, the first 2 years under Brian Kelly, was signing double-digit transfers both years, and it had to get the roster numbers back up. But that's not the case this year. They're now over the 85-man scholarship limit, sitting around 88 or 89. And so when they're looking at the transfer portal and what LSU's done this year, they haven't signed as many people, and part of that is they've missed on a few, certainly at cornerback. But they've also just haven't gone after nearly as many players. But they've been trying to get, like you said, guys who filled instant needs at key positions. Wide receiver was a big one, trying to get some experience back in there after Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas declared for the draft. LSU's got a lot of talented wide receivers on the team, but not a whole lot with a lot of experience. Xavier Thomas and C.J. Daniels from Liberty certainly address that. They're going to be guys who are expected to contribute right away. Jordan Gilbert, a safety from Texas A&M, similar in that regard, who had started most of Texas A&M season in 2022. He's going to be expected to start for LSU next year. Those are kind of the three who stand out as probably your instant starters who LSU brought in through the transfer portal. Swan is going to have the chance to compete with Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback, but Garrett Nussmeier is still probably at the moment, expected to be LSU's starter next fall. But Swan, we'll see what he can do, if he can push him, if he can make Garrett, if he can he's going to have to go out and take that job, but we'll see if he can do that starting in the spring. And then LSU also signs Jair Brown, a corner, who's going to be in the mix there, and then Austin Osbury provided some depth at safety. So, that's kind of how it breaks down in terms of what they've added through the transfer portal so far, but they might not be done yet because they really need defensive tackles, and maybe they can get some through the portal in the second window.
Guest defensive tackles for their new defensive line coach to coach. You broke the story about John Jancic being released and a couple offensive analysts as well. What's the story there in regards to, was it a recruiting lack of production there, or just flat out coaching, or what was the deal with Jancic?
So John Jancic came to LSU as a defensive analyst and then was promoted to outside linebackers coach and special teams coordinator last spring. the defensive line coach is not his area of expertise. But 2 days before preseason practice, LSU's defensive line coach Jimmy Lindsey had a medical issue. He had to be taken away from the facility in an ambulance, and he ended up missing pretty much the entire season and was never returned to like a full on-field coach capacity. So Jancic gets moved to defensive line coach right before preseason practice, and it just clearly wasn't a good fit. 5 games into the season, LSU brings back Pete Jenkins, longtime defensive line coach, to be sort of to try to help him and try to help coach that position. And after the season, Jancic was retained initially when LSU cleared out its defensive staff. But his role moving forward was never clear as to what that was going to be. And as LSU continued to hire all of its on-field coaches, he wasn't going to have an on-field role. LSU finished out his defensive staff a couple of weeks ago. Bo Davis is the defensive line coach after getting him from Texas. Kevin Peoples is coaching edge rushers after they got him from Missouri. And there wasn't a clear spot for where Jancic was going to go. And so, thought he might be staying as an analyst going into next season. He had one more year left on his contract, but that ends up not being the case, and he's no longer with the program, and we'll see where he ends up. So really just kind of a matter of, him not really, he was never going to be their long-term defensive line coach because that was, like I said, it's kind of just a patchwork thing that got put together last season to try to get through it after Jimmy Lindsey's issue. But then when the staff kind of came together, there wasn't an obvious spot for him going into next season.
So this is an obvious position of need in regards to coaching and development and everything, considering what this defense looked like last year. It was a track meet each and every week that Jaden Daniels had to stay ahead of the curve in that long list of great receivers. Defense is a source of pride at LSU. Is there reasonable hope that they can get back to LSU standards?
Well, there's always hope, I guess, especially this time of year. Hope springs eternal. But LSU has certainly gone about trying to revamp this defense by bringing in talented coaches and bringing in people on that side of the ball who maybe can coach this group better, recruit better talent at certain areas where LSU has just been talent deficient, the secondary in particular. And it started by hiring Blake Baker as its defensive coordinator from Missouri. And then it went and got Bo Davis, renowned defensive line coach from Texas. It got Kevin Peoples from Missouri. It got Corey Raymond, a longtime LSU defensive backs coach, brought him back after 2 years away from the program. He had been at Florida. And then hired kind of an up-and-comer in Jake Olson as their safeties coach. And the theme with all of these coaching hires that LSU made, it also did a couple of moves on the offensive side of the ball after Mike Denbrock left for Notre Dame. Everybody who LSU brought in had previous Louisiana ties, either has already coached within the state before, played in the state before, you may be from the state. Like all of those, that everybody on the staff now around Brian Kelly has that with that theme, has that on their resume. And Brian Kelly said yesterday it wasn't necessarily the determining factor in the hires that LSU made. But it was certainly an intentional part of the process in which LSU went about hiring coaches, was that it was kind of part of the desired job description that you had experience in Louisiana recruiting it. Like we talked about earlier, LSU wants to lock down this state in recruiting. And these are, when you look at it on paper, guys who should be able to do that. And so that's really helpful for the long term, but also in the short term, they're known, a lot of them, as good talent developers. And LSU, after not adding a whole lot of defensive players through the transfer portal, is really counting on being able to develop the players who are currently on the roster. And so we'll see if these coaches are able to do that and able to get this defense to a place where it is better than, where it was last year, which is not hard to get, not hard to be better. It would be hard to be worse than they were last year defensively. So we'll see how much they can do in a year's span. They've got some pieces like with Harold Perkins, but they've got to be able to get the most out of what they have.
Yeah, Harold Perkins 2 years ago. So in 2022, I don't know if I saw a better defensive player in college football in regards to making just game-changing plays. I don't know if they win at Arkansas, if he's not there, and some other games where he was just otherworldly. Did he have that type of season last year? It didn't appear so, and maybe they were asking him to play coverage more, or maybe a bit of a different role for him.
Yeah, it was not the season that you would have expected from Harold Perkins going into his sophomore year, when he was now for the first time throughout the season a full-time starter. He was disruptive in moments. He still led LSU with around 13 tackles for loss. He had, I think, 5.5 sacks. He had some quarterback hurries. But it wasn't as consistent and as dominant as he showed he could be as a freshman. And part of that was because his position was kind of in flux the whole year. LSU was trying to make him an inside linebacker in the season opener, immediately abandoned that after the loss to Florida State. It did not go well. He ends up sort of settling in as kind of a Sam outside linebacker, kind of sometimes playing the nickel. And he got actually much better in coverage throughout the year, but he was playing a lot of coverage, which took him away from the ball. So it's going to be fascinating to see what Blake Baker, LSU's new defensive coordinator, does with Harold, because Blake's also the linebackers coach, and he is going to be coaching Harold really closely. Do they try to move him back inside, or do they use him as more of an edge rusher? These are all kind of questions that LSU is going to have to start to answer in the spring, because in terms of pure talent, he is the most talented deep player on their defense, and maybe on the entire team this year, now that Jaden and Malik and Brian Thomas have gone. And he has a ton of potential, but LSU has to help him kind of tap into that. And it starts by really finding the position that's best suited for his skills, because he's so fast. He's so good at getting after the quarterback. He's not a bad coverage linebacker anymore after going through a season of it, but it takes him away from the ball. And so we'll see how LSU balances those things going into next year. His junior year, which if it's a good year, obviously, you would think that he's headed off to the NFL after that. So you really want to try to get the most out of him as much as they can this season.
Folks, please like the video. If you enjoy the content, subscribe here at the Voice of College Football. Check out Wilson's work there at The Advocate. You see it right there on the screen, theadvocate.com, and also his various Twitter handles there with NOLA News, and of course, The Advocate on X. You mentioned the state of this program following the Joe Burrow era, the transition, and 2020, 21, the state of the roster not in a good place by LSU standards. Brian Kelly comes in. So he gets them to Atlanta the first year. This next year, shoot, if they beat Alabama on the road, then they're going to reach their goals again. They win a Heisman Trophy through Jaden Daniels. And so what are your thoughts about Brian Kelly's first 2-year performances, and how are LSU fans accepting what he's been able to do thus far?
The view on it, and I think from the fan base too, is that he has stabilized what had become very rocky. LSU in 2021 had its first losing season since 1999. And this roster at the Texas Bowl after that year, which is when Ed Orgeron got fired, had 39 available scholarship players. There was more on the roster, but in terms of who was healthy and available at that game, it was about 39. And so there was a lot of work to be done over the last 2 years. And Brian Kelly was able to come in and at least stabilize things again, get LSU back to a point where it's competitive. They now have back-to-back 10-win seasons. That's not something that happens at LSU a whole lot, because it's has a tendency to be somewhat volatile and up and down. And so that's all good signs. But after, especially this past season, there was, because year one exceeded all expectations. The Vegas line win total was, I think, maybe 6.5 or 7. Brian Kelly's first year. They obviously go on to win the SEC West. But last year, 10-3 again, a 9-win regular season. And there was just this feeling that LSU sort of wasted a generational type offense with Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, and the number one offense in the country. They don't even make it to a near 6 game. And so there's, I think, especially as you go into year 3, the honeymoon is over. It probably ended sometime last year, definitely after the loss to Florida State in the season opener. And now LSU's got to get to a point where it's competing for a 12-team college football playoff. It's really got to be in the mix there and making that. Is it going to happen this year? Who knows? We'll see. But Brian Kelly has to have the program in those in playing games that matter late November and getting to those playoff games going here into the rest of his tenure, because LSU has gotten to a point where it's certainly better than it was at the very end of the Ed Orgeron era, but now it's just about competing and winning championships. And we'll see if they can start to get there in year 3. There's certainly some questions that have to be answered over the next throughout the rest of the offseason. But that's kind of this overarching state of the program.
Wow, great rundown on LSU football. You can get a whole lot more from Wilson, of course, at theadvocate.com. Is there anything else that people need to be aware of in regards to tracking your work?
Oh, everything's over at theadvocate.com, nola.com. My Twitter handles there is probably the easiest place to find, everything that we do. We also have if you're looking for a podcast or anything like that, we have a podcast that you can find on Apple and Spotify. It's called LSU Sports Insider. That's also every Monday and Thursday on our YouTube channel, which is LSU Tigers on NOLA.com. So if you want to go to the YouTube LSU Tigers on NOLA.com, you can find that there.
Awesome. Wilson, great rundown. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.